I'm going to be standing about where Ned is, so
I gotcha.
if that works for you,
Yep,
works
that's
for
fine.
me.
Yep. So right in frame.
It's a big crowd.
Alright. People like old buildings.
Welcome, everybody. I'm Ned Allen, Director of the Bridgton Historical Society. If you don't know me, we're really thrilled to have you here, and we're really excited to have Chris Kloss from Maine Preservation, who's going to be helping us with a really important survey of the town. He's also been consulting with us on the restoration work we've been doing at Narramissic, and he and his organization are just a tremendous resource, and we're lucky to have them. And I won't waste any more time and just turn it right over to him.
Okay, thanks, Ned.
Yep.
Thank you. I'm overwhelmed. I didn't think we'd get 35 people, but that's about how many are here, so great. I appreciate the opportunity to speak to all of you this evening on behalf of the Historical Society here in Bridgton. We've had a long relationship with Ned and the organization, at least in the 9 years I've been in Maine working with Maine Preservation. The title of the show tonight, as you can see, is at the top, Preserving Rural Character, Community Character, and the Role of the Architectural Survey. The project that Ned mentioned, for which they have a sizable grant for, is the Architectural Survey of the town of Bridgton. And I wanted to kick off the project publicly, or help Ned do that this evening, by giving an introductory slideshow. There will be several more of these for the volunteers, but we'll go into greater depth on the actual architectural style of each of the types of properties that are represented here in Bridgton, and that the volunteers will be seeing when they go out in the field with their cameras. But I wanted to tie the idea of the survey and its role into community planning. So that's what I'm going to address for the first few minutes. And then we will talk about what you may expect to find out in the field. Next. I knew it would work. But first, of course, the outline of this evening, we'll talk about the survey, we'll talk about the Architectural Resources Survey form, there's a picture of that, and then we'll go into the types of styles that you would be likely to encounter. Next, please. Of course, we have to have a commercial first, so. Our organization is approaching its 50th anniversary in several years. We're a membership organization that was formed in the Portland area in 1972. We have about 1,500 members statewide currently. I won't read our mission, but you can see what we do. Next. Thanks. I actually one back.
Gotta figure that out.
My job at Maine Preservation is to manage the Field Services Program, which is one of the 5 that I'll speak of here this evening. I circuit ride the entire state of Maine, providing information to municipalities, developers, private homeowners, nonprofit organizations, just about anyone who has an interest in historic preservation and the use of that tool in downtown revitalization or preserving community character in the more rural communities. We have another program called Protect and Sell, formerly called the Revolving Fund, where we actually acquire options on properties, take over the responsibility for marketing them, create a preservation easement, and then at the sale of the property, we record the preservation easement so that that property can be preserved in perpetuity. We don't actually own any of these buildings, or at least for very long. With an option, we own the building for about 5 minutes. We've done half a dozen of these in the last several years, and it's a program that's growing to the point where we now have a full-time real estate manager at the office in Yarmouth. Preservation easements, that program goes back now probably 15 or 20 years. We have 10 easements on properties around the state. The largest one probably you're all familiar with is just down the road here at the Shaker Village in New Gloucester. We have an easement on 17 of the buildings there. That is a popular program. There are For those of you who may be involved in estate planning, I'll just say that there are some tax incentives involved. So if you're involved in estate planning work, this may be a way to not only preserve the family property, but to also shed value at a time when you need to do that. Every year in the summertime, we announce our most endangered places list, and that usually consists of anywhere from 10 to 15 properties around the state. They're not necessarily always buildings. We've included bridges as well, landscapes, other threatened aspects of the built environment. One year I think we included historic wooden windows on the list. This last year was quite interesting because two of them involved MDOT, and one's a bridge and the other is downtown Wiscasset. So we're not afraid to lock horns when we need to. And finally, in order to train the preservation planners of the future, we have a summer fellow program, and usually take on 4 graduate students that work with us for a 10-week period during the summer. Half of that time in the trades with a general contractor involved in preservation, and the other half of the time at the office, helping us prepare the most endangered places and the honor awards program, which I didn't put on here because I ran out of room, but that's held in November. Last thing I'll say is our annual meeting and Old House Forum is held every May. This year it's going to be in Camden. You're all welcome to come. If you're not a member, there's a small fee, but we have a good day we put on with 3 or 4 speakers about technical issues associated with the field, and then have our very brief annual meeting and a luncheon. It's usually a good event. Typically we attract about 100 people. So you're all welcome if you'd like to do that, or call the office for more information. Okay, Ned. Now, I mentioned earlier that we would talk about the composition of an architectural survey and what it does. Next slide, please. First, I wanted to say that it's directly linked to the process of comprehensive planning. The state of Maine in 1943, for the first time, required that any community that wanted to enact ordinances at the local level would need to engage in a comprehensive planning process and come up with a document that represented a roadmap to the future for that community. And that still applies today. I know that Bridgton does not have zoning, nor does it have any protections for historic properties in the form of a historic preservation ordinance or a landmarks ordinance, or a demolition delay, or probably half a dozen other types of legal tools that I could mention to you that are used in other communities pretty effectively, I will say. Norway probably is one that I would mention to you that a couple of years ago we helped them enact a demolition delay ordinance, and I think that's worked pretty well up to date. The idea of preserving rural character is a slippery thing. I've been in the planning business for most of my adult career, and it's a hard thing to do. But one of the very first steps that you have to engage in is to identify what it is that constitutes the rural character of the community that you're trying to preserve. That is the place that you call home, or where you work, or where your family has lived for 200 years, or where the family farm is. Without codifying those things in some sort of a survey or document that enumerates what they are and where they are on a map, you really don't have much of a base to start with. So that's part of what the architectural survey does. We look at the buildings, or what I'll call the built environment. It's not always buildings. It can be stone walls, it can be barns, it can be other types of structures, bridges, lots of different things. We look at those things and try to canvass the local community and look at anything that is older than 50 years old. And the reason we pick that date, and I'm not sure yet that's been settled here in this survey, but I'll just say to you that the 50-year look-back period actually comes from the National Register for Historic Places. That's one of the criteria that they use to consider a building eligible for the National Register. Now that's a rolling deadline. So everything before 1968 at this moment could possibly be listed in the National Register if it met the other criteria. But it's looking at the age of all of us here tonight, it's hard to believe that anything from 1968 is already considered historic, but that's our luck in life. Anyway, that's how we go about looking at this, and that rolls forward every year with each passing year. I've mentioned that there are several different types of ordinances that can be used to protect historic resources. Regulations, other types of planning tools. There are also economic incentives. I'll get to those in a few minutes when we talk about what the financial incentives are for preservation that we have both here in Maine and is offered by the federal government. And then finally, there are private sector legal instruments like preservation easements that I mentioned earlier, or other types of instruments that will protect a building for a limited period of time or sometimes in perpetuity. Next, please. Why is the architectural survey important? What does it do? So in addition to identifying where these resources are, what they are, and putting them on a map, we also look eventually at the other end of the survey, not the front end. We also look at their level of significance, either at the local, state, or national level. Again, those levels of significance flow from the National Register of Historic Places, which is a program has been managed by the National Park Service since 1966 when it was created. Most states, most local governments now that have historic commissions use those standards. The information that's going to be created here in Bridgton will eventually go into the comprehensive plan in the appendices, and it will remain there permanently. Some communities don't necessarily use the 50-year look-back period. Yarmouth is currently looking at a 75-year period. They previously did a survey back in the 1970s, and they're now updating that work. So it's a dynamic document in that it lives on because of its attachment to the comprehensive plan. Its main use is helping, and I'll call them the planners, even though most of us are citizen planners, volunteer planners. It helps improve the quality of future land use decisions, because when you look at a map and see where these resources are, and particularly when you see clusters of them, and I know in Bridgton you have at least 4 discernible villages, you'll actually see what looks like districts of buildings. And that's a pattern that will emerge as we do the survey. So the ability to discern what the impact of a land use decision may be is better understood when you have this information in front of you and you can say, well, do we want to allow a, I don't know, I'm not picking on McDonald's tonight, but since I just ate there. But in the middle of a pristine historic district, do we want a McDonald's or something like that, or a Family Dollar store, or a slaughterhouse, or whatever? So yeah, I think you get the idea. Additionally, the survey will help foster a pride of place through civic involvement and a better understanding of what your own legacy is and what the patrimony of the town is in terms of its historical meaning. I think lastly, the statement about anchoring the community in the knowledge of its future development, its past and future development. I've been involved in planning for many years, and one of the things that I've picked up over those years is that to have a perspective that looks both to the rear and forward, I think helps balance and make a more informed decision. Next, please. Now, we get down to the aspects that have some meaning, some additional meaning in the economic value of the survey. Usually when the survey is finished and promoted and there are more public meetings like this and a good slideshow that shows you some of the great buildings that are in this town. I've actually been working in Bridgton since the mid-1990s, not in my current position but as a consultant, so I know the town somewhat. And you've got some great buildings here that represent a long and wide range of architectural style in the history of the nation's architecture. But the identification, once this information becomes known, I think stimulates people, because these buildings aren't going to be reproduced again. These styles are gone. They're not being reproduced now, or at least not very well. And they represent different meaning in terms of the political history, the design history of our towns and cities. And by the influence from overseas, up until the 1870s, we imported every architectural style that you'll see in this country. So after that, we began to understand that we could have our own style. The identification of landmarks, the erection of markers, historic markers, the creation or recognition of scenic roads with historic architecture along those roads, or a downtown, all these things enhance tourism. And I think you all know the importance to our economy in Maine of tourism. People come here to look at us and see what we look like and where we live and where we work. And we've got some great buildings to be able to tell that story. National Register designation, which is something that can follow later for some of the properties that will be identified if people are interested. You can either individually identify a building, get it on the listed on the National Register, or create a historic district. National Register does not protect buildings. It only offers limited protection from federally funded projects. It has no impact on local property ownership or individual property ownership, or at the local level. So it's not a form of zoning. It's an honorary designation that protects you from federally funded projects. But it does also have lucrative tax credit incentives, which were created in 1976. The federal tax credit is 20% for rehabilitating a building that's on the National Register. And since 2008, when Maine overhauled its state tax credit, we have a 25% tax credit in the state of Maine, which you can use against your Maine state tax liability. Those can be combined. So imagine buying a historic income-producing building and getting 45% of your investment back. I'm not kidding about this. 45% of your investment back, because you can combine the two programs. I won't dwell on this too long, but that's the greatest lollipop we have in the field of historic preservation today, and have had for a couple of decades. Just to give you an idea of the magnitude of scale, since 2008, and remember what happened in 2007 in this country, since 2008, there have been over 95 National Register income-producing buildings rehabilitated in the state of Maine, with an investment that represents nearly $500 million. Not million, $500 million. So I can give you the rest of the statistics if you wanted, but not tonight, about the thousands of units of affordable housing that have also been created, the several thousand jobs, both in construction and permanent jobs as well. So we have a nice little industry going here in Maine with our historic building rehabilitation work. Identifying some of the buildings that can be income producing may bring to owners, maybe some of you in this room, the possibility of some financial help with some of these buildings. And then finally, I mentioned the number of affordable housing units. That's particularly important because Maine's economy is suffering because we don't have places where people can live affordably close to where they work. Gee, I'm sounding like Governor LePage here for a minute, but that is true, and we need to create more affordable housing so that we can support our economy and allow people to not have to commute every day, but live closer to where they work. Next, please. Okay, finally, let me just say that by deepening the community's understanding of itself, it generally turns out, for those who want to take the trouble to read the survey and understand the history of these buildings, there's usually a deeper sense of community responsibility, both at the planning board level and I think among individuals. you have a pattern now, which goes way back to the 18th century, of 4 major villages and then a rural landscape around it, which is still largely agricultural or forested. Have to throw in the resort industry also that made its appearance in the 19th century. But it makes it a very unique place. Bridgton, because of its water resources, its water power, the 3 woolen mills that existed here, the presence of the railroad up until the 1940s. It's a pretty unique place. It's also a beautiful place to live. So the architecture contributes to the natural environment and complements it. Let me combine the last two. The tax base of Maine's communities is extremely important to the quality of the environment that we want to have and continue to have in our homes in Maine. I'm sure you all know of historic buildings that have not been maintained or couldn't be maintained because there wasn't the money in the family to do it. Stimulating preservation of these buildings ultimately is going to feed the tax base. It's going to strengthen and fortify our local tax base. And that's the bottom line in terms of our maintaining our communities and our school systems and jobs. Ned, if you could move me on to the next one. So, enough sermonizing on the value of the survey. These things surveys have been in operation in practical practice since the 1930s, beginning in Savannah and Charleston. That's really where a survey got its start. I'm going to show you what the survey form looks like in a minute. It's a 2-sided form that's provided by the Maine Historic Preservation Commission. They've used it forever. It's periodically updated, contains a lot of interesting information about the building. And to give you an idea what the rest of the project looks like, there will be a period now which Ned is working out over a period of several months this spring where we'll train the volunteers that are going to do this. The field photography and the filling out of the forms in the field is the field component. Excuse me. And then finally, if there's time and the spirit and willingness to do it, the state of Maine, meaning the Maine Historic Preservation Commission and MDOT, share something called the CARMA database, which is a computerized database which stands for Cultural and Architectural Resources. I knew this would happen. You've got the idea. I should know that by heart, but I sometimes forget the last 2 letters. Anyway, these survey forms are downloaded into a statewide database so that at the state level, eventually, 100 years from now, I don't know when, we'll have a pretty good idea of what's out there in terms of Maine's historic architecture in many of the communities. It's I've forgotten how many thousand entries are in it now, but it's something that we can do here if there's the time and the willingness to do it. Next, please. So here's what the survey form looks like. I don't know whether anybody here can read that, but it's a little blurry to me. Ned, is that, can we improve the, okay. Let me just say that there's property location and contact information. You've got a couple of, he's good, I want to use him again. Can you all see what we've got here now? So when we get through the contact information and what the current use of the property is, we get into the architectural data. And there's probably 20 different styles listed here. So usually one or more of those is checked off. If it's a mixture of styles, you get a second chance and you can put a secondary category in there. If it's a very old building that's been remodeled, that's where we would use these two. We look at the height, number of stories, talk about the primary facade, how many bays, doors, windows, and then finally what the appendages are: rear L, wing, porch, tower, added stories, cupola, bay window. I can't read some of the others. Dormers, And then the back is more of the same, but in a little more detail. And then there is a section on the back also where you can fill in the historic information. Date it was constructed, if there was a local contractor or even an architect involved, there's a place for that. And then there's a couple of lines just to give what the surveyor may know about the significance of the building. So these can be filled out usually in 5, 7, 8 minutes. I don't know, it depends how good you get at it. But one of the things that the training covers is helping the volunteers understand how to identify the architectural style. That's quite important. We can move on. So that's what we're going to move into next. Any questions at the moment? I don't want to be the one talking all night and not allowing any
This might
questions.
sound silly, but are you just doing it from the street view to the front? Are you doing, I mean, I could be counting windows till next week.
Great. Yeah, we won't be calling people ahead of time to clean up their yard. No, the volunteers will not enter onto private property. That's sort of a standard rule of the game, and any photograph will be taken from the street. Yes, sir.
With Google Maps as it is, you can see that right on your computer.
On rainy and snowy days, that's not a bad idea. The problem is that some of the pictures on Google Earth go back as far as 2011. So we're looking for something current.
Okay.
But good point. And let me just add to that though. For a property that has a long driveway and can't be seen from the street, that may be a resource or not. Usually Google, I don't think Google goes onto private property either when they photograph these streetscapes.
But I think there's
But
drones.
you can see the roof planes and you can see if there's a barn attached or if it's connected architecture, that sort of thing. So it could be of some help. So that's a good point.
What
Yes.
about something instead of building, for instance, a private property root cellar? Obviously, you're not supposed to go on to the property, but you can see its existence from the road. And there's one I love in your zone. So do you can you ask permission of the homeowner to get a picture closer up?
Good question. We normally get a letter from the Board of Selectmen or the Planning Board, or co-signed by both, introducing the project in the form of a letter to the homeowner, and each volunteer will carry one of those letters with them in case the shepherd comes out after them or there's an altercation at the mailbox or whatever.
Yep.
So that's a partial answer to that question. If the volunteers know of a resource that can't be seen from the road that is important like that, I mean, an actual dedicated root cell in a farm complex would be pretty important. So I would, unless, Ned, you can think of any reason not to, if I don't know whether it should be the volunteer or whether it should be Ned calling ahead first. I suspect that I'll be right with you. I suspect that the better way to do this might be, if you know of such a thing, talk with Ned, and then we call the owner first, rather than just show up when they're in the shower or having breakfast. Go ahead.
Yeah, just curious, and my comment/question ties in both with previous. Remote sensing is what we're talking about.
Mhm.
So there's a layer called LiDAR, that when you look at this layer, you can see these things through the trees. It's done from above with lasers, and you can see these, like, as if you strip all the vegetation off the plant. You can see all the old stone walls and cellar holes, and I was wondering if that could possibly be, or if it is a component of this.
Could you spell that?
LiDAR is an acronym, LIDAR, for
LIDAR.
laser something something
That's,
something.
that's how they discovered all more ruins.
Yeah, currently,
Like the
Mexico.
Egyptian
Exactly.
tombs and all
Yeah,
that?
we have
Okay.
that for this. That coverage exists for this area.
It does.
Yeah.
How do we, can we
I
access
did not know about that.
Yep. For free.
Oh, we want that!
That's our price range.
So is that, how would you access that?
It's multiple ways, but someone mentioned Google Earth. Google Earth has become very savvy of late, and you can look at various products where just 5 years ago it couldn't. There's a thing called Main GIS.
Yeah,
It's where the state stores all its GIS layers, geographic information.
familiar with
systems.
that. Yeah.
And one of those layers in there is this new LiDAR coverage. And you can
Really?
actually pull that right into Google Earth and look at it.
I'm going to actually send a memo tomorrow to the Maine Historic Preservation Commission and see if they know about it, and if they don't, that's great to know, because you know, when you have to review a project that's using state or federal funds and it's, you know, north of Millinocket, this could be pretty handy. So, great, excellent comment, yeah.
The comprehensive plans have to be redone every 10 years.
Yep.
Does the survey have to be redone every 10 years, or can you take a survey from the previous one and put it onto the next one? You know, how long is the usefulness of this
Yeah, that's a
information?
good point. And I just today looked up your comprehensive plan and see that it went through the review and was approved in, I wrote it down here, 2015. November 16th of 2015, the review was considered complete and consistent and was approved at that point. I don't know of any community that does an entire architectural survey again over every 10 years. I mentioned Yarmouth. There are a couple of other communities I've run into where they did their first surveys in the 70s or the early 80s, and they're starting to do them over again now. So that's a 30-year period. And I would think that would be more than adequate. Every 10 years would be an exception, but nice thought. Good job creation. But you know, we're not picking up that many new homes probably in a 10-year period to warrant doing something of this magnitude every 10 years. So I would say, now the exception to that would be if you decide to only look at properties 75 or 100 years in age, then you've missed everything back to 1918. So that would leave a big gap in 20th century history. You know, today most things built in the 50s are starting to be considered to have significance in 20th century architecture because things changed so much after the war. But good observation. Anybody else? Yes, sir.
After the federal style, 1820, what was going on then?
Well, I'm going to get to that. In fact, we're going to go all the way from the federal style to about 1950. So I'm about to get rolling with that. Ned, if you could. So this is, I'm only showing this because someone would be bound to ask me, well, what did we have before 1720? Well, in Massachusetts, which we were, of course, once a part of, we have a sort of a generically assigned building style called first period, which was considered really 1620 to about 1720. And we don't know of any of these in Maine. We believe that they're all gone. Although I bet if somebody looked hard enough down in York or in those parts, you might find a first period building. The two buildings that you see here, this one is in Dedham, it's the Fairbanks House, was built in 1637 to 41. Of course, it's been added onto over time.